Hello and welcome back to Supposedly Fun. I am Greg, here today to wrap up the month of October and talk to you about the books that I have read in this month. It was not my best reading month. I think I only read 6 books. I have my Goodreads. God, I put it like miles away from me, and I've mentioned before, I actually do wear glasses. I just don't like wearing them, so I put it so far away I can't actually see it. Here we go. I have my Goodreads in front of me as reference. I read 1, 2, 3, 4. So I have 5 books that are finished right now, because one of them's not on here right now. I finished it last night. And I have 1 book that I'm going to finish tonight, come hell or high water. So I will have read 6 books in the month of October by the time that's done. That is the least I have read in a month in this year so far, but I'm fine with it, because if you remember, I threw out my TBR that I had made in the interest of giving myself some freedom, alleviating some stress that I had created with the idea of following along with readathons and things like that. I was doing buddy reads. I was trying to read a lot of things at the same time, and it was stressing me out. So this is kind of what it needs to be. I'm looking at a fresh start in the month of November. I did not finish Under the Banner of Heaven. I will not finish Under the Banner of Heaven, which is what I'm listening to on audio. So that is something that's going to carry into November, which is fine. Nonfiction November will be obviously starting in the month of November, so it can carry into the month and start for that. I have a book from the library that is nonfiction, so it will fit for that. I would like to try to fit a novella in November in. We'll see how that goes. I don't know if I'll manage it or not, but let's jump right in and talk about the things that I finished. So in the beginning of the month, the first thing that I finished this month was The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins. I listened to this on audio. It is a very long audiobook. It's a long book, so I guess that's really not that surprising. And I liked it. I didn't love it. I think parts of it were really, really good. It took a long time to get going. The version that I listened to had a lot of forewords and prefaces and things like that you had to get through. There was a lot of table setting before you got to the actual book, which was a little irritating. Once you got to the book, it was great. So if you haven't read it, this was something that I did that would be a crossover between Victober and Spookathon. It kind of met both of those. So in the beginning, a man is on the road and he meets a kind of ghostly appearing woman in white. Somehow in my head, because that woman is described as ghostly, I always assumed that the woman in white is a ghost story. It is not. It is a gothic tale of insanity and identity and a little bit of gender roles, because there are wicked men doing things in this book, and it is interesting. And it's really interesting to go back in time and read a book because that it was written a long time ago, because the writing style and what the writer is trying to do is very different. The Woman in White takes its time deliberately. It is a deliberately slow-paced book. And it is good for us as modern readers to remember that not all books need to be fast-paced. But I will say I thought this did drag in some ways that it didn't necessarily have to, and it spent a lot of time on a lot of detail that you didn't necessarily need. If I was living in the time when this book was published, I probably would have enjoyed that a lot more. But, I don't live in the time when that was published. So I did really like this, but to me it ended up being kind of a 3-star read just because it did drag in parts. The next book that I finished was Cranford by Elizabeth Gaskell. This is something that I read for Victober. I listened to it on audio, actually, and I definitely recommend that. The audio presentation was delightful, and this book was delightful. I'm so glad I got to it. This is easily in the top 5 of my favorite reads for the year so far. I don't think it'll crack the top 2, but it's up there. It may even be number 3. I haven't sat down to think about it, but it's really up there. I really enjoyed it. So it is a portrait of the residents of an English country town called Cranford. It mainly follows a woman named Maddie Jenkins. It is told by a friend of hers who doesn't actually live in Cranford anymore, but she spends a lot of time there, to the point where she might as well live there. And it's just so delightful. It is really predominantly about these women and society and class and the roles of these women and their places in society, and it's just so good. If you've read and loved Jane Austen but have not read Elizabeth Gaskell, get it done, because this is wonderful. I can't wait to read more books by her. Though I mentioned this in a previous video, and it seemed like the consensus opinion on the next book by Elizabeth Gaskell that I should read is North and South. If you have other recommendations, drop them in a comment down below, because I am absolutely going to read another book by Elizabeth Gaskell at some point. Oddly, I chose this one just because it happened to be the one that was available immediately on audiobook through the Libby app, which is a library app, and that was the entire reason I chose it, and I just loved it so much. It was so good, and there was a part, I don't know spoilers, but there was a part that almost made me cry. This book nearly became one of the few books that has made me cry, but the number of which is growing. But I didn't. I just ended up misting up. But so there were no actual tears. But it was so good. I really just loved Cranford. So if you haven't read it, if you haven't read Elizabeth Gaskell, I absolutely recommend that. And I'm grateful to Victober for putting that in front of me. The next book was actually a DNF. It's Normal People by Sally Rooney. And I have a physical copy of this, but I listened to it on audio. And I got about 2 hours into it, and I really just wasn't liking it. I wasn't into it. Now, earlier this year, I read Sally Rooney's other book, Conversations with Friends, and I had a really great nerd experience reading it because I had used an index card as a bookmark, and I was tracking all of these really interesting things that Sally Rooney was doing in the book as a writer, and a lot of ideas that she repeated throughout the text. And it was really interesting to see when those ideas kept hitting and when they went away and when they came back. So I had this great nerd perspective read of Conversations with Friends, but the reality is I didn't actually like the book at all. I mean, it's really well written, but I didn't like it. And I guess because I was listening to this on audio, I wasn't even having that nerd experience. I don't think there was anything in here that would have given me that nerd experience. I may try looking at the print version at some point, just in case it does have that. But I really wasn't into it, so I thought to myself, why am I doing this to myself? I don't have to. So I stopped listening to the audiobook, returned it, and we're done. And that's it for that. The next book that I finished was William Faulkner's The Light in August. I talked about this a little bit already in my reading vlog yesterday. I've talked about this a little bit throughout the month already. So Brian at Bookish, and I think it's Alan at Big Hard Books and Classics, did a read-along of Light in August in the month of August. Makes sense, right? So I was too late to jump on that bandwagon, so Doris from Aldi Books and I decided we would do Light in August in October. We actually started this in September, but it became Light in October for us. And we finished it toward the end of the month, and we both enjoyed it, but we both had some problems with it. I think it's really interesting, a lot of these things. And by the way, I recommend that this is a book that benefits from reading with someone or following along with videos like the ones that Brian and Big Hard Books and Classics did, because I feel like I would have missed a lot of this. I am from the north, Doris is from the south, so she picked up on a lot of things, because William Faulkner was a southerner. She picked up on a lot of things that I would have sailed right over my head if I hadn't been reading this with her. She also understands religion and that part a little bit better than I do. My parents didn't educate me in the ways of like the Bible or anything like that at all. So it's like a glaring hole in my knowledge base when it comes to things like this, where the Bible and religious elements really do pop up a lot. So I'm very grateful to Doris for that. Interestingly, one of the biggest things I picked up on in this book was a lot of gender play and gender role play that William Faulkner does. Obviously, race is in this a lot because he's the main character, but there are a lot of characters. Joe Christmas is possibly mixed race, so there's a lot of that. But I picked up on all of this really interesting stuff with gender. There's a character, Miss Burden, who is repeatedly described in these masculine ways. And at one point, Joe Christmas is on the run. He trades shoes with a woman on the road. So I thought in my head that he was wearing women's shoes, which I thought was really interesting. But then I went back to the text and realized, no, the woman was wearing her husband's shoes in the first place. But then even that was interesting to me because the book opens with Lena Grove, who is pregnant, leaving home. And as she's on the road, she is carrying men's shoes with her. So I feel like there's a lot of really interesting gender play in this, which probably I hadn't seen a lot in a lot of the criticism of it, and I thought that was fascinating. And I think the religion angle is interesting. I think there are ways in which Faulkner is being deliberately confusing and forcing the reader to engage in the text, and that's fine. You know, every once in a while, you need to read a book that forces you to engage with it because it exercises your mind. You don't want to keep reading the same thing over and over and over again. So this was definitely different for me in that perspective. But there are some ways in which I feel like it didn't it was kind of annoying the way it was set up. Like, I would get into a rhythm of things. Faulkner's a great writer. He has a really great flow to his writing. But every time it jumped around, I felt like I was thrown out of the book, and I had to find my way back into that rhythm. Which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it was a little bit irritating. I also think it's interesting that the most vibrant characters in this book are the characters are on the perimeter. Joe Christmas himself, you do get a lot about him and a lot about his history, but he's kind of a blank. And I know that that's deliberate, but it also makes it hard to access him. And I think that's, again, deliberate, because I think Faulkner wants you to try to like reach for Joe Christmas and access him. He's not just doing all of the work. He wants you to participate as well, I think. And that is an interesting way to structure things. Doris and I had also talked about telling versus showing and that idea. And it's not a critique that we usually use, but you can see where somebody would criticize Faulkner for telling, not showing. And I think I don't like it as a criticism, because I think that it says that telling is bad. And telling can be fine as long as it's done well. And this is, I think, would be telling done well-ish. So, yeah, take that for what you will. That's Light in August. Now, I was supposed to finish Blacklight by Kimberly King Parsons last night. I had 2 short stories left. And I really felt like I just needed a break. So what I did is I picked up an audiobook that I happened to have just sitting waiting to be looked at. It was Cocaine Blues by Carrie Greenwood. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with, there's a show on Netflix, it's an Australian TV show called Miss Fisher's Murder Mysteries. It is set in Australia, and it's about a woman in the 1920s who solves mysteries. And it's kind of a fun show. I watched the first season only. I haven't tracked with the remaining 2 seasons, but it was kind of a cute show, so I thought I would try the book. It's more of like a cozy mystery, and I don't know why I keep trying cozy mysteries, because they always let me down. I have never found one that I really liked, and this was really just followed suit. The writing was not good. It was kind of predictable. The character of Miss Fisher, who's so vibrant in the TV show, really doesn't come across all that well, and maybe that's because it's the first book and they're kind of figuring things out. There is a lot of time spent introducing characters and putting them into place, so later on in the series they will come to fruition and the relationships will expand, but I just didn't like it. So, kind of a dud. And that leads us to Blacklight, which is short stories. I'm doing this as a buddy read with Simon from Savage Reads, and I am, come hell or high water, going to finish this tonight, because I don't want to have this lingering into November, so I just have, I think it's 50 pages left. I'm going to do it. So this, I think, is pretty solidly a 3-star read for me at this point, because there were some stories that I kind of thought were interesting but didn't quite like. I'll talk more about this once I've actually finished it. But that's kind of where I'm stuck. And I talked to Simon about this, but the writing reminds me a lot of Ottessa Moshfegh. And I have not read an Ottessa Moshfegh book that I liked. I didn't like Eileen in the end, and I DNF'd My Year of Rest and Relaxation. So I'm sticking with this. I'm trying to keep an open mind, but it does repeatedly remind me of Ottessa Moshfegh, who is not a writer I am all that enthused with. So we'll see how it finishes, and we'll go from there. So that is everything that I read in the month of October. In terms of reading goals, one of my goals for this year was to read more books by women than men. So let's track this. We have Elizabeth Gaskell, female. Sally Rooney, Wilkie Collins is male. William Faulkner is male. Carrie Greenwood is female, and Kimberly Kim Parsons is female. So that's 4-2. Doing pretty okay. Another goal was to read more books that have LGBTQ representation that is not focused on the G, so lesbian, bisexual, transgender, or questioning. I didn't get any book that hit the LGBTQ spectrum in any way this month. But I was in really good shape before that, so I'm not too broken up about it. In terms of reading for November, I mentioned this yesterday. I'm not going to do a real TBR. I am going to think about what I want to prioritize to read before the end of the year, and I will do a video on that next week. So stay tuned for that. I'm going to start November. I have a buddy read coming up with Sean the Book Maniac. We're going to do Ladder to the Sky by John Boyne. I almost dropped book. Woo! I have Elton John's autobiography from the library, so I'm going to do that. And beyond that, no firm plans. We'll see how that goes. So that's everything I read in the month of October. I'd love to hear what you read. If you have any opinions on these, do you have any alternate readings of Light in August that you would like to throw at me? Drop them in the comments down below. And as always, thank you for following along. It's always appreciated. If you're new to this channel, hi, how are you? I'm Greg. It's nice to have you here. And anyway, I will be back. Until then, happy reading.